A female adult Neanderthal is using a retouched flint scraper to strip the remaining tendons from a child's femur. Inch by inch. The owner of that bone was a child from her own band, no older than 8. This is not happening inside some cannibal's lair. This is a perfectly ordinary limestone cave in northern Iberia. 100,000 years ago. Outside. Temperatures have plunged below zero. Glacial moraine has sealed off every valley pass. For 3 consecutive months. Not a single trace of large game has appeared. Her brain is undergoing a biochemical collapse. Severe protein starvation has pushed gluconeogenesis to its metabolic limit. Her liver has begun dismantling her own muscle tissue to maintain blood sugar. And her prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for moral judgment and social taboo, is systematically shutting down higher cognitive functions as glucose supply dwindles to almost nothing. 43,000 years later. A team of Spanish paleobiologists working deep beneath the surface of El Sidrón cave in the province of Asturias extracted more than 1,700 bone fragments from a cemented layer ophyte. Every fragment was covered in stone tool cut marks identical to those used in the butchering of wild deer. Ancient DNA analysis revealed the truth. All 13 individuals who had been dismembered, whose bones had been cracked open, whose marrow had been sucked dry, every single one of them belonged to the same patrilineal family. In today's episode, we are going to stare directly at the most suffocating fact in the history of human evolution. When starvation drives a species to the edge of extinction. Kinship bonds. Tribal loyalty. Even a mother's instinctive drive to protect her child, in the face of natural selection's iron law. All of it can be breached. Northern Iberia. 100,000 years ago, nothing like the Mediterranean warmth you might picture. The overture to the last glacial period had already begun. The Scandinavian ice sheet was advancing southward. Atlantic current patterns had violently shifted. The entire northern slope of the Cantabrian Mountains was smothered beneath a wet, bone-cold fog that almost never lifted. Above 600 meters. Coniferous forests were dying off on a massive scale. Replaced by a pale gray belt of tundra scrub, stunted ericaceous plants creeping along the permafrost. Incapable of providing sufficient calories to sustain any large herbivore. El Sidrón cave sits embedded midway up a limestone escarpment. Its mouth faces north. Barely 3 meters wide. Extending inward roughly 30 meters before branching into several narrow side passages. Frigid groundwater seeps perpetually through the cave walls, freezing into a thin glaze of ice in winter. This was not an ideal place to live, no south-facing sunlight. No spacious living area. Not even adequate ventilation to clear the smoke from a hearth fire. But it possessed one critical advantage. Concealment. In a winter where prey had vanished entirely, cave leopards and wolf packs were equally maddened by hunger. And a Neanderthal camp exposed in open terrain was nothing more than a slab of fresh meat laid out on a table. This family group consisted of 13 individuals. Based on subsequent skeletal analysis. 7 adults, 3 males. 4 females, 3 adolescents aged roughly 12 to 15. And 3 children. The youngest approximately 2.5 years old. Determined by the degree of deciduous tooth eruption. Their body structure was classically Neanderthal. Males averaging around 5'5" in height but weighing upward of 175 pounds. All that extra mass coming from abnormally dense bone and thick trunk musculature. Their rib cages were barrel-shaped. Their clavicles extended nearly 1.5 inches longer than those of modern humans. The supraspinatus attachment sites on their scapulae were rough as sandpaper, meaning their upper limbs possessed throwing torque and close combat grappling force far exceeding that of Homo sapiens. But in this moment, these bodies, engineered over 300,000 years of evolution for close-range killing, were being destroyed by an enemy they could not fight. Starvation. Scattered across the cave floor were the last few red deer rib bones. Gnawed over and over. Their surfaces bleached white. Every digestible scrap of periosteum and cartilage long since scraped clean by teeth. The ash in the hearth was cold, they no longer had the energy to venture outside and gather firewood. Among the 3 adult males, at least one was later found to have Harris lines on the shaft of his right femur, dense transverse bands left behind when bone growth halts, marking multiple episodes of severe nutritional interruption throughout his life. But this famine clearly exceeded anything any of them had ever endured before. The first to die was almost certainly the 2.5-year-old child. Neanderthal infants typically weaned around age 2, based on strontium-barium ratio analysis of their teeth. Meaning this child had just lost the protection of breast milk only to collide head-on with the total absence of solid food. An infant weighing no more than 26 pounds has a surface area-to-volume ratio far greater than an adult's, heat loss occurring at more than twice the rate of a grown male. With zero protein and fat intake. A child that small has a survival window of no more than 72 hours. After that child's body went cold. What happened inside the cave? The answer is carved into the bones. Let's bring our gaze down to the microscopic surfaces of these 13 skeletons. Inside the laboratory of Spain's National Museum of Natural Sciences, the team led by researcher Antonio Rosas scanned the surfaces of more than 1,700 bone fragments one by one under high-magnification stereomicroscopy. The results were chilling. On nearly every long bone, femora, tibiae, humeri, radii, dense, uniformly oriented parallel striations were found along the midshaft. These are the classic cut marks left by a stone tool's edge during the stripping of muscle. The distribution pattern of these marks was statistically identical to the butchering traces found on red deer bones recovered from the same site. First, a circumferential incision through the ligaments at the joint. Then longitudinal stripping of large muscle masses along the shaft. The more critical evidence lay in the extraction of marrow. Nearly every long bone exhibited characteristics of green bone fracture, spiral fracture planes with smooth, clean edges. A pattern that occurs only when bone is still fresh, still saturated with organic matter and moisture. Had the breaks occurred naturally after drying, the fracture surfaces would be jagged and rough. Beside every shattered long bone lay a flat stone slab known as an anvil stone, paired with a hammerstone used for striking, the standard tool kit for marrow extraction. Marrow. In a state of famine, it is the body's last high-calorie reserve. The medullary cavity of a single adult Neanderthal femur can hold approximately 80 to 120 milliliters of yellow marrow, with a fat content as high as 80%. Meaning the marrow from a single thigh bone could deliver roughly 600 to 800 kilocalories of pure energy. For a starving individual who has already burned through every gram of subcutaneous and visceral fat, this is liquid gold. The difference between death today and survival until tomorrow. But here lies a deeply unsettling physiological detail. When a human, or a Neanderthal, has been in a state of severe protein starvation for more than 2 weeks, the liver's urea cycle is on the verge of collapse. At that point, consuming large quantities of protein, such as the muscle tissue of a conspecific, triggers a metabolic crisis known as protein poisoning, or rabbit starvation. Excess amino acids undergo deamination, producing ammonia that the liver can no longer convert into urea fast enough. Blood ammonia levels spike, causing nausea, diarrhea, and even clouding of consciousness. This explains precisely why marrow, rich in fat rather than protein, was the component most urgently prioritized in famine cannibalism. The bones of the 3 children actually showed a lower density of cut marks than those of the adults. This was not mercy. Children's periosteum is thinner. Their muscle attachment areas are smaller. There is simply less soft tissue available to strip. But on their cranial fragments, a unique pattern of marks was discovered. Concentrated percussion points on the squamous portion of the temporal bone, the temple region. This was done to breach the cranial vault and extract brain tissue. A fresh human brain contains approximately 60% fat. Weighs around 1,400 grams, Neanderthal brains were even heavier. Between 1,500 and 1,600 grams, and a single brain can yield more than 1,500 kilocalories. For a starving group, a skull was a high-calorie fat container. Ancient DNA analysis peeled back the final, most brutal layer of truth. The mitochondrial DNA of these 13 individuals, inherited through the maternal line, displayed high diversity, representing at least 4 distinct matrilineal lineages. But Y chromosome analysis, the paternal line, revealed extremely low diversity. All adult males shared the same patrilineal haplogroup. What does this mean? This was a textbook patrilocal, female exogamous social structure. Males remained in their birth group, while females married in from other bands. The women who were eaten had once walked into this cave from the outside. They carried different mitochondrial DNA. They carried the genetic memory of different mothers. They married into this family. And then, when the famine came, they, along with everyone else, became cut marks on bone. Now let's reconstruct the moment everything turned. Deep inside the cave, the hearth has gone out. Among the 13, the weakest individual has already died, perhaps the toddler. Perhaps an elderly female whose bones later revealed severe periodontal disease, meaning she had been unable to effectively chew solid food for a long time before death. The body lies on the mud floor of the cave. Within hours, its temperature has equalized with the surrounding air. What happened next was not a single moment of madness. The Neanderthal prefrontal cortex was comparable in volume to that of Homo sapiens, even slightly larger. They possessed the modern variant of the FOXP2 gene, suggesting they may have had some form of language capacity. They painted patterns on shells using manganese oxide pigments. They scattered pollen over their dead, though this point remains debated. These were not mindless beasts. They knew what they were doing. But the brain is a ruthless energy accountant. An adult Neanderthal brain consumed roughly 400 to 500 kilocalories per day, nearly 25% of its basal metabolic rate. When glucose supply drops below a critical threshold, the prefrontal cortex is the first region to be throttled. Moral judgment. Long-term planning. The maintenance of social taboo. These higher cognitive functions are the most expensive computations the brain runs. And they are the first to be sacrificed in an energy crisis. What takes over is older, more energy efficient. Limbic-driven processing. Fear. Hunger. Immediate action. When the first cut was made, the hand holding the tool may have been trembling. But the stone was sharp. The tools recovered from El Sidrón were knapped using the Levallois technique, with edge angles between 25 and 30 degrees. Cutting efficiency comparable to a modern surgical scalpel. Severing the deltoid and supraspinatus from their attachment points at the shoulder joint requires a precise stroke along the bony crest of the greater tubercle of the humerus, an action identical to the one they performed when butchering the forelimb of a red deer. Muscle memory took over. There is no evidence of cooking. No fire-induced discoloration was found on the bone surfaces, only a handful of fragments showed slight thermal alteration, likely from incidental contact with hearth remnants during later sedimentary processes. This means the muscle tissue was almost certainly consumed raw. Raw Neanderthal muscle, deep red tissue saturated with myoglobin. Similar in texture to uncooked wild boar tenderloin but coarser in fiber. Tougher to tear. Their teeth were built for this. Neanderthal incisor where patterns indicate lifelong use of the front teeth as a third hand for ripping through tough materials. But here lies a critical evolutionary paradox. Cannibalism saved the survivors' lives in the short term. Yet from the perspective of gene transmission, it was catastrophic. These 13 individuals shared a vast number of alleles. Killing and consuming a close relative meant destroying gene copies that heavily overlapped with your own. Hamilton's kin selection theory is ground to dust here. When the immediate pressure of individual survival overwhelms the long-term calculus of genetic interest, the scales of natural selection tip without hesitation toward the most primitive survival instinct. And there was another, more insidious killer. Prion. Consuming the brain tissue of a conspecific can cause a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy called Kuru, misfolded prion proteins that, over the course of several years, riddle the cerebral cortex with holes until it resembles a sponge. The 4 people of Papua New Guinea suffered a Kuru epidemic triggered by funerary cannibalism. Did the Neanderthals face the same threat? We don't know. But if this cannibalistic behavior recurred within the population, the cumulative transmission of prion could have severely degraded the cognitive capacity of an already fragile, small-numbered group within just a few generations. This may be one of countless dark threads woven into the Neanderthal extinction. Not slaughtered by Homo sapiens. Not frozen to death by climate, but devoured. Bite by bite. By their own desperation. The year 2000. The province of Asturias. The Pelona region. A torrential rainstorm scoured a natural shaft in the El Sidrón cave system, exposing a layer of ophyte sediment containing bone fragments. The first to find the bones were a group of amateur spelunkers. They assumed these were remains from the Spanish Civil War. This area had served as a hiding place for Republican guerrillas in the 1930s. When forensic analysis was brought in, the radiocarbon dating results shattered everyone's expectations. These bones dated to approximately 49,000 years ago. Over the 15 years of systematic excavation that followed, more than 2,500 bone fragments and a substantial collection of stone tools were extracted from a depositional area no larger than 200 square feet. Every single bone was catalogued, scanned, and sampled for DNA. The puzzle slowly took shape. 13 individuals. 1 family. 1 famine. 1 act of cannibalism. Inside the climate-controlled storage vault of Madrid's National Museum of Natural Sciences, the bone fragment catalogued as SD-1253 rests quietly on a pad of acid-free paper. It is a piece of temporal bone belonging to that 2.5-year-old child, no more than 4 centimeters long. On its outer surface, under stereomicroscopy, 3 parallel cut marks are clearly visible, evenly spaced, uniform in depth, running from back to front. These are the operational traces left by someone using a stone tool's edge to strip away the temporalis muscle. The temporalis, that thin, fan-shaped muscle connecting the coronoid process of the mandible to the lateral wall of the skull. Its total weight on a 2-year-old child would not have exceeded 15 grams. 15 grams. Someone, in a pitch-black cave 100,000 years ago, painstakingly scraped 15 grams of muscle from the side of a toddler's skull. This bone will not tell you who did it. Was it the child's mother? The father? Or a band member with no direct blood relation? Ancient DNA can confirm that kinship existed, but it cannot identify the hand that gripped the stone tool. Disturbance of the sediment layer means the original spatial relationships between the bones have been permanently lost. We cannot know who was consumed first, who was the last survivor, or even whether anyone ultimately walked out of that cave alive. The only thing we know for certain is this. No one came back to bury them. These bones were not intentionally interred. They lay scattered across the cave floor, later washed by mudflows into deeper fissures, slowly encased in calcium carbonate precipitation, sealed away by 100,000 years of silence. No burial structure. No grave goods. No trace of ochre pigment. After these people were consumed, the remaining bone fragments were abandoned in place, like the kitchen scraps of any other meal. Nature does not write tragedy. Nature only executes thermodynamics. The total chemical energy contained in the body of a 2.5-year-old Neanderthal child is approximately 70,000 kilocalories. Inside a sub-zero cave, those calories were distributed among the body's still drawing breath, converted into ATP, driving cardiac muscle contraction, maintaining core temperature above 95 degrees. This was an energy transaction of absolute coldness. No good. No evil. No sin. Only the precise exchange of joules and calories. And today, the mitochondria inside every single one of your cells are executing that same exchange program. The only difference is, your refrigerator is full. But don't forget, that refrigerator has existed for less than 100 years. And hunger ruled our species for 300,000. Those cut marks carved into bone are not an ancient horror story. They are a memo written to the deepest layer of your genome, reminding you what lives beneath that thin skin of civilization inside your body.